Hello YouTube, this is going to be your no-nonsense guide on how to both play and build Mavuika properly. Mavuika is a character that has taken a few days to actually fully understand for a majority of the Genshin community. Her build hasn't really changed much in terms of what's optimal, but her combos have changed essentially every day since release. So it's very possible any day 1, day 2 releases for her guides may be wildly inaccurate today, and that's not against the creators, we just didn't know what to do yet. But let's start with Mavuika's actual kit, and to start explaining things, I think it'll be easiest if we start with her elemental skill. So Mavuika has an 80 Nysal point limit, which will automatically get filled whether you tap or hold her skill, and a 15-second cooldown. So her tap mode will initiate an off-field damage mode, in which any enemies around her every 2 seconds will get hit by a pretty okay amount of pyro damage. It has no internal cooldown, meaning every single hit will apply pyro, and it's worth mentioning that anytime you swap off-field, if you have Nysal points left over, this mode will automatically be engaged. Her second mode, her hold E, will be her bike on-field damage mode. So this completely rewrites all of her talents, making her normal attack talent completely relevant. It is worth mentioning that all of her on-field damage attacks will share internal cooldown. All that essentially does is make it a little bit harder to spam reactions, and particularly in melt teams, it will be pretty important to follow these combos to the T, because if you do a dash or something instead of a charge attack, that is a lot of potentially lost damage. Okay, with that explained, now let's move on to her elemental burst. Mavuika is the first character in the entire game to not rely on energy particles. Instead, she has her own function called Fighting Spirit. Essentially, Fighting Spirit is just charged by the usage of Nysal points anywhere in your party. So whenever those are drained, her burst gets charged. You can also charge it by hitting enemies with normal attacks, but it's worth mentioning this is a lot slower. The last important thing to know about Mavuika's burst is that it has varying levels of strength based on how charged it is. The bare minimum to use it is 100 Fighting Spirit, but it will get stronger all the way up to 200 Fighting Spirit. Damage gained this way will be in the form of actual talent scalings, which is the best way to improve them, and it will be for your burst itself, the big nuke, and for any normal or charge attacks hit in bike mode for the following 7 seconds after it's cast. For those 7 seconds, you also cannot lose Nysal points, so whether you are on-field or off-field, you will continue to do damage with Mavuika. It is worth mentioning that this buff is so significant to her damage that the moment it goes away, you lose almost all reason you have to stay on-field and continue doing damage. One exception to that rule is Furina teams, because if you don't stay on-field doing damage a few more seconds with Mavuika, instead you'll be standing doing nothing on Furina, waiting for her skill to come back. Okay, so now let's talk about her passives. The first one is pretty simple. This is going to be an attack buff that will go up in actual uptime depending on how many Nightland party members you have, only having full uptime with 3 or 4 Nightland party members. The simplest way to explain her second passive is the opposite of Yelan's burst. Basically, you'll get a damage bonus on your on-fielder for 20 seconds after you use her burst, and that will be for any on-fielder, not just yourself. And the more Nysal points you have, the more damage bonus you get. Minimum will be 20, maximum will be 40. Now when it comes to our constellations are pretty fine. They're not really out of this world in terms of damage increase you get from constellations. Just keep in mind these banners are extremely predatory, so please spend wisely. Alright, so when it comes to Mavuika's artifacts, she has one outstanding clear choice. Obsidian Codex is by far her best on-field carry set. It is still relevant for teams where she is an off-field sub-DPS, such as Chaska, though when her personal damage is less relevant and she wants to buff other characters, something like Cinder City is a much more appropriate, where it will buff your damage percent for any related reactions she triggers by 40% for 20 seconds. Essentially what that means is if she triggers Overload, you'll get Electro and Pyro damage bonus across the party. If she triggers Burning, you'll get Dendro and Pyro damage bonus. Though I will say it's not the most reliable in Burning teams, because you won't really be able to get it if you already have an existing Pyro aura, making it impossible to trigger after the first rotation pretty much. In those teams, if her personal damage just isn't very good compared to others, then she is able to use Deepwood, but like, it'd probably be better on somebody else. Alright, so when it comes to Mavuika's main stats, her most optimal are going to be Elemental Mastery Sands, Pyro Goblet, and Crit Circlet. EM Sands will be best in her best teams, being Melt and Vape teams, though if you're using an EM Sands, have a ton of EM substats, have a good EM buffer, or an EM weapon, then an Attack Sands is still totally fine. And of course, in teams where she's not vaping or melting, Attack Sands will also be better. And for substats, those are the only valuable substats she has: Attack, Crit, and EM, because ER is completely useless for her. Alright, so when it comes to Mavuika's weapon choices, she obviously does have her signature weapon, and beyond that, every single claymore that has a useful Ascension passive is good on her. Verdict, Red, Horn, Wolf's Gravestone, Beacon are all pretty good, but for Serpent Spine and Beacon in particular, it is worth mentioning it is a little bit harder to not overcap your crit rate, and if you are overcapping your crit rate, they may be slightly worse than they would be otherwise. Also, honorable mention to Serpent Spine, if you actually have really good uptime on the passive and you have Refinement 5, it can be basically tied for second best. It's crazy to me how this weapon has basically just never fallen off. Besides that, our most free-to-play relatable options are Mailed Flower, which unfortunately the passive won't really be active on her burst, but it is still pretty good, and Rain Slasher, which is really really only good in vape teams and completely useless out of them. Title Shadow is also very good, but only in teams where you're running a healer that can actually give you heals. So in teams with both Furina and Bennett, it'd be pretty good because you can actually take advantage of Bennett's healing. And in teams with Yelan where you're willing to burst, it'll also be pretty good. And I mean, Talking Stick is also useful, like you can bring it. Do I even have it? I don't think I ever pulled Talking Stick. Oh my god, it's so shit. If you're getting a battle pass weapon, please pick Serpent Spine. And beyond that, the only other option that's really worth mentioning is Blackcliff. The passive isn't something you really want to consider when you're picking it, but it just having crit makes it okay. Also, all of that is based on vape or melt teams. If you're not playing one of those, it is the exact same essentially, just remove the EM ones. Alright, so let's move past the surface level stuff with Mavuika and talk about her team compositions. As of right now, Mavuika is one of the most expensive characters in the game. She has to have off-field Natlan party members to function properly, and we currently have 4 of them. 2 of them are 4 stars that don't work very well with her at all, and 2 of them are absolutely amazing. You can use Auroron for a team like Overvape or Overload, and you can bring Kachina in teams like Melt or in Vape if you just don't want to bring Auroron for whatever reason. But Kachina provides almost nothing with her kit at all, and while Auroron is okay, this just isn't really the kind of team he shines in. That being said, let's talk about what currently is good for Mavuika. I do really hope we get more options in the future, but right now, this is about it. Of course we do want Bennett, he needs no introduction. And then we will also need either Yelan or Citlali for pretty much any premium Mavuika team. Putting them together will make the best one we have right now, but you can definitely make very strong team comps with only one of the 2. For example, with Citlali, you can just run a VV character in place of Yelan, or you can bring another cryo character like Diona for slightly more consistent cryo application and an EM buff, or Rosario for a crit rate buff. I don't really like double cryo that much, I do prefer VV, but it works. The reason I'm not bringing up vape melt teams is because teams like this will do very poorly against any unfreezable mob in the game. Without yapping too much, if you apply cryo and then hydro, the resulting freeze will deplete both auras. That'll give Mavuika less reactions, and that is bad. But you do get a lot more freedom and flexibility if you have Yelan, mainly because Yelan just synergizes so well with Mavuika, and there are more options for hydro and cryo off-fielders than there are Natlan res shredders. Before I get into the specifics, I will go ahead and say a majority of the cryo and hydro off-fielders in the game will function. Namely, the ones that I know that don't work but you would think would are Mona, Diona does not apply enough, Layla does not apply enough, and that characters like Rosaria and Kokomi can work, but do feel a lot worse than other options due to how circle impacted they are. But the teams I'm going to talk about and show combos for are, of course, Citlali, Yelan, Furina, and funnily enough, Xingqiu. I know he is kind of out of place here, but there is some fun tech I do want to talk about with him. As of right now, the rotations and combos I'm about to show are the most consistent and strongest, though it is possible in the future there might be more developments and there might be better ones. If there are any very good examples of this, I will make sure to pin it in the comments. And if you end up having any problems or confusion with these rotations, feel free to come ask for help on my Twitch. I do stream 6 days a week, and I am always helping my viewers. Final note before I get started, keep in mind that all teams are timestamped. If you have particular interest in one, feel free to skip to it. Alright, so let's start with Citlali Melt. If you were not aware, it is a lot easier for Pyro to deplete a cryo aura than it is a hydro aura, so generally melt teams will be significantly harder to play, and that will be reflected in the combos. The current best way to play Mavuika with Citlali is after your Mavuika burst, you want to do a very brief pause to ensure that your Citlali reapplies cryo before you do any charge attacks, and then you want to do 3 charge attacks, and then let go to let your finisher hit, then do a dash, 3 more charge attacks, another finisher, dash again. And at that point, you should be either out or just about to be out of your buffed stance. If you have the time, you can do 1 more charge attack followed by another finisher, but if you can't, it is totally fine. That is a very minor DPS difference. And keep in mind that the melt teams will be the hardest ones to play in terms of not over-applying pyro, so if you're having any issues with the timings, look at what I do and when I do it in the video. Also, the best way I've found to consistently melt your Mavuika burst is to make sure that before you swap off of Citlali, you even a very quick N1. That extra normal attack with the cryo application will help ensure Mavuika gets a melt on her burst. Alright, and with Citlali covered, let's talk about Furina, the most premium Hydra support in the game. Furina does have a few more gameplay issues than I expected in this team. Namely, her energy recharge requirements are very hard to reach without Favonius, so I would highly recommend running both the Near Sands and Fav if you can. And also the fact that her skill has a 20-second cooldown, and with this it will be the longest cooldown on the team, making it to where she will be the slowest part of the puzzle. That is not a deal breaker though, because what she provides is very significant, and it's worth mentioning in a team like this where her personal damage isn't crazy. A set like Tenacity to the Millilith will be pretty good if you have it. And one more thing, if you still do end up struggling with Furina's energy requirements, you can also put Favonius on Yelan, because honestly, that is the only good 4-star she has. And this setup will be a little bit different. I am going to recommend that you try to use Furina before Bennett this time. If you didn't know, after you cast E with Furina, there is a very brief pause, and then after that, all 3 of her pets will attack at a very similar time. time. All three of the first hits will apply Hydro, meaning if you were to use her burst first, then her skill, and then you quickly swap to Bennett, use a skill, dash, and burst, you will not have many issues when it comes to still landing a Mavuika Vape. This is a pretty nice adjustment because it will give you slightly more time to stack Fanfare on Furina, and it will also give you more uptime in Bennett Burst, which is especially valuable in this team because if you don't recall, you will have to do a few extra seconds of on-field damage with Mavuika to avoid just twiddling your thumbs waiting for Furina skill. While editing, I did discover something new. Here it just applies to Furina teams, but it could apply to pretty much any team that is longer than 18-second rotations. So with just Yelan and Mavuika, you are not maxing out your fighting spirit with a normal rotation, and one way to deal with that is by doing 2 skills per rotation with Yelan. But I stumbled across a completely different way of getting the exact same effect. With Yelan, if you do skill, 1 normal attack, dash, jump, and then 2 normal attacks, that will pretty dramatically increase the amount of Night Soul points you drain. Because of that, you'll be able to very consistently max out your fighting spirit with a much smoother rotation and while still getting a couple extra seconds of on-field damage. That method should be a lot more consistent for anybody on high ping or with delay, and with smoother rotations, it'll allow for another second or 2 of damage with Mavuika. But this team is still very good. I consider it to be your second best, and is especially good for those who have constellations on Furina. Now for the combo itself, as I said earlier, vape combos will be a lot simpler. Our main goal is just to do 9 charge attacks and vape 5 of them. And the way we're going to do this is quickly after our burst ends with Mavuika, we're going to start just spinning. We're going to land 5 charge attacks in total, and then after the 5th one hits, we are going to dash and then do 4 more charge attacks. At this point, what you do is completely up to you, to be honest. Just remember to spend roughly 2 to 3 seconds on field out of your burst buff mode, just to try to maximize efficiency as much as possible. There are significantly more complicated rotations than this, but I have not found them to be much stronger, and they are a lot less consistent. And now for Yelan. She does have a similar issue to Furina in the sense that she has very high energy requirements in this team, which will also slightly diminish her damage potential, which means you will regularly be basically forced to run Favonius. And this definitely is one of the cases where you definitely want to lead with Yelan E before your burst, just to make sure that your energy requirements don't hit an unrealistic level. This setup here will be very similar to Citlali, and you also do want to weave in a single normal attack just before you use Mavuika burst, just to ensure you have a consistent aura. After the animation, you do not have to pause at all. You want to immediately start doing a combo of 2 charge attacks and then a dash, 2 charge attacks and then a dash, over and over for a total of 4 times. Thankfully, Yelan's cooldowns are short, so after your damage window ends, you can immediately move on to the next rotation. Unfortunately, Yelan doesn't really have any good set buffing options, so you're basically just stuck with Emblem for now, and I do like this team a lot more than I expected. There were a lot of people saying that you can't really use coordinated attack damage dealers with Mavuika effectively, but thankfully that isn't true, and this team is probably going to be one of my favorites. And lastly, for Xingqiu, he's kind of the wild card here. You really do not expect to see him in a video like this, but he has honestly exceeded my expectations for one reason and one reason alone. If you did not know, he has 2 different methods of applying Hydro. He has his coordinated attacks from his burst, and he also has a mechanic known as orbitals. His orbitals get summoned from either his skill or his burst, though you are able to lose them if you only use your skill, because if you get attacked 4 times total, they will deplete 1 at a time. And I have tried and tested a lot of these teams, and I have not been able to use a single combo in which Xingqiu's Hydro aura, exclusively from his orbitals, can't keep up with Mavuika's Pyro app. The reason that's so nice is because if you have a weapon like Sacrificial Sword R5, this has a 16-second cooldown, meaning your rotations will be incredibly quick, and Xingqiu will have the least field time out of everybody in the team. This is to such a degree where you actually have to do the same thing you do in Furina teams, where you stay on field a couple more seconds, but it's only because his animations are so short. What this also means is a 4-piece set of Emblem or something is completely irrelevant. It doesn't matter, meaning he can provide a somewhat meaningful buff to Mavuika, and if you don't have Sec R5, you're also able to run a high energy weapon like Favonius and just alternate rotations between your skill and burst, which does provide pretty much the exact same effect. The only downside I can think of is that you have really high energy requirements, but that doesn't really come at the cost of anything because his personal damage just doesn't really matter. That is to say though, if you are playing Xingqiu, I'd recommend trying to avoid using his burst in case you kind of just have to because he misses sack proc, just because using it consistently extends rotations to 20 seconds, which provides the same downsides that Furina has, but without much of any benefit at all. In forcing Xingqiu's most consistent and optimal rotations, I'm just going to recommend that you use the same ones as Furina. They're very simple, they're very comfortable, and they get you near peak potential performance. I do just want to remind you that there are a lot of other options that you can bring, like Kokomi works, Nilu's pretty solid, Ganyu, Charlotte, C6 Kaya. There are a lot of characters that can work here. When it comes to the cryo characters, they will be a bit less flexible, and you will likely have to learn particular rotations for each of them. And if you do want to see a more comprehensive guide on those particular rotations in the future, let me know in the comments and I will make an update video on what is best for them. Alright, and so that should encapsulate pretty much everything you need to know about Mavuika combos in order to actually play her effectively. And if you enjoyed the video, please do leave a like like and or subscribe. Also, I do stream 6 days a week on Twitch, so if you do want help with your account in any way, I do that very regularly over there. Feel free to leave constructive criticism in the comments. I am very new to guide making, and if I did anything well or did anything pretty poorly, please make sure to let me know. And that is all from me. Have a great night, YouTube, and take care.